You are listening to the People First podcast.
People First is a self-advocacy group run by people with learning disabilities, and People First podcast is a platform to raise awareness about real issues that affect people with learning disabilities in our community and all around the world.
We aim to inform and entertain our listeners by interviewing interesting guests and talking about the things that really matter to us. This is like having a stage to speak out and get our voices heard.
Recently, there has been a very high-profile story in the news about the pop singer Britney Spears and her battle to free herself from her conservatorship. In the simplest of terms, a conservatorship means that someone is legally allowed to tell someone else where they can and can't go and what they can and can't do. In Britain, this is called a deprivation of liberty order. The British government want to change the laws regarding deprivation of liberty, so we wanted to talk to someone who knows all about these things to learn how it might affect us or people that we know. Today we are joined by Dr. Lucy Series from Cardiff University, who has kindly offered to answer some of our questions about this issue.
Hello, Dr. Lucy. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry it's taken a while for us to do this, but I'm excited about talking to you guys.
Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your professional background?
Sure, thanks for that question. So my professional background is a bit complicated. When I was growing up, I had a friend at school who was at my primary school actually, but we became friends at secondary school, who was autistic and had learning disabilities. And we spent quite a lot of time hanging out together. And that and some other personal experiences led me thinking, I've really enjoyed this. I'd like to work more with people with learning disabilities and autism. So I did quite a lot of different jobs. I've worked in supported living. I've worked in care homes. I've done in the school holidays. I used to do a really cool job called social inclusion work, which was saying to kids who didn't find it as easy as their peers to get out and do what they want, how do you want to spend your summer holidays? And then making that happen. But my experiences in adult social care were a bit less fun. I felt like people were often denied the kind of rights to make choices that me and my friends were making. The example I often give is one guy had lots of money sitting in his bank account and he wanted to spend it on a mobile phone. And the service that he was living in said that he wasn't allowed to do this because his mum was worried that he might phone people with it, which obviously is the point of a mobile phone. So I guess she was right, but this wasn't a very good reason, I didn't think, for stopping him spending his money how he wanted. So that was at the kind of that was at one end of the spectrum. And then I also worked in a service for people with more significant cognitive impairments and autism who didn't communicate using words. They communicated in other ways. And I saw some really shocking things in this service. It's a bit depressing, but I won't go into it. But there were very high levels of restraint. And actually the service ended up being shut down because it was quite abusive. And at that time, in the middle of the 2000s, I suddenly stumbled across this brand new law that had happened called the Mental Capacity Act. And everyone was really excited about this law because they said it was going to give people more choices over their lives. It was going to give back to people the right to make choices like how you spend your money. And it was going to make sure that people weren't being restrained when they shouldn't be and things like that. So I was very lucky. I got someone, the EU, in fact, gave me some money to do a PhD, which basically means spending 4 years reading a lot, talking to lots of people and thinking a lot about this law. And I got quite interested in a little bit of the law, which is called the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards. And the deprivation of liberty safeguards is a sort of funny old framework. It's something that says if you're deprived of your liberty, if you're so restricted by the people caring for you that you're not free to leave, you're not free to make most everyday choices about your life, then you need safeguards. And the safeguards are people coming in who are completely independent to look at your care and see whether it's right or if it's too restrictive. You've got stronger rights to advocacy. And if you're really unhappy with what's going on, you can actually go to court and say, this isn't okay. And the court can make a decision about what's fair. And I thought these safeguards were quite important because these guys that I'd worked with who'd been so restrained, they weren't in a position to just, fill out a complaints form or ring up a solicitor. They needed someone to come in without them having to start that process off. And I thought that the safeguards might be helpful for them. So my career since then has just been studying this law, the Mental Capacity Act, studying human rights, and looking at these liberty safeguards. And that's why I've ended up working with you guys, because we did a piece of work together about it.
That was quite in detail, and thank you for that. Can you tell us how the deprivation of liberty safeguard currently works?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think I'm going to answer that with a story, if that's all right, about a guy called Stephen Neary. That might help make sense of it. So Stephen Neary is a real person, and if you put his name into the internet, you can find out lots about him because his dad, Mark, writes a blog about the kind of adventures they have in adult social care together. So Stephen Neary, when he was 21, was living with his dad, Mark. He has learning disabilities and he's autistic, and it sounds like he was living his best life, to be honest. He went out swimming, he loved swimming, he went to the gym, he had lots of mates in his local community, and he had really good support from people that he liked and who knew him well. But one winter, I think it was 2009 it would have been, his dad got flu. And because his dad got flu, he wasn't able to look after him. So he rang up social services and said, can Stephen go to stay in his normal care home that he goes to for respite, which Stephen knew and was okay with. So Stephen went there and he was quite upset because I think this was a bit unplanned, a bit unexpected, and it's quite important for some people with autism to have a bit of warning when changes are happening. And for some reason, the council decided to take Stephen out of this respite care that he already knew and plonk him in something called a positive behaviour unit. So the positive behaviour unit was technically a care home, but what they were trying to do was almost kind of reprogram Stephen to be a different kind of a person. So they were using something called behaviourism, which means using trying to change someone's behaviour by modifying the rewards that you give them. And part of that was actually taking away all the things that Stephen was used to in his life, all his hobbies, all his interests. So he became more and more distressed. And unfortunately, that had the effect of the behaviour unit trying to get more and more intensive with their robot programming methodology, because he was becoming upset and they saw this as bad behaviour instead of just thinking, this guy is really disorientated. What's happened to his world? So Mark gets better, the dad, and he says, I want Stephen to come home, and the council won't let Stephen come home. Stephen is getting more and more upset and he actually runs away. And when the care home find him, they bring him back, they put locks on the doors, they ban him from going on his day trips, and they say, right, okay, he's now deprived of his liberty because he's not allowed to leave and we're not letting him go home to his dad. So what the care home have to do if they're depriving someone of their liberty is ask for something called authorization. And that means like a permission from the government, effectively. So they go to the council that have put Stephen in this care home, right? They go back to the council and say, right, we think that we're depriving him of his liberty. Can you authorize it, please? So what the council have to do is they're meant to find someone called a best interest assessor. And a best interest assessor is usually a social worker, but they could be a nurse or a psychologist or an occupational therapist. But the really important thing about the best interest assessor is they're meant to be trained in human rights. They're meant to be trained in the Mental Capacity Act. And this is the really important bit. They're meant to be completely independent of all the decisions about putting that person where they are and their care. So this best interest assessor, what they're supposed to do, if the law's working right, is they're supposed to come and talk to Stephen asking what he wants. The law calls it your wishes and feelings, your values and beliefs. And then they're supposed to talk to the people that know Stephen well. So that would be his dad, and ask what he thinks about what Stephen would want. They're meant to talk to the people caring for Stephen. So that would be the care home. And this is the really important bit. They're meant to look at whether there are less restrictive ways of caring for Stephen. Now, less restrictive could mean all kinds of things, right? It could mean anything from like, don't restrain that person so much, right through to, could they live somewhere else where they'd be happier? And in this case, the obvious place would be to go back home again, right, with his support. But this was not a very good best interest assessor, and they didn't think about that. They didn't do their job right. Okay, so safeguard number 1 fell down. It didn't work. But from lots of other people, that safeguard does work. Okay, so there are some really great best interest assessors out there. And for lots of people, they'll say, well, couldn't you just do it like this? And that could just be all that's needed. But in this case, that went wrong. So we go to the next safeguard, and that's advocates. So time is going on. Stephen's really upset. Mark, by this point, has got the local media involved, and the local media are reporting on his campaign. He's got a Facebook group called Get Stephen Home, and lots of other carers are joining it. And I'm sitting at my desk in Cornwall at the time, tapping away on my PhD. And a mate of mine sends me a link to Stephen and Mark's story. And I write back saying, oh, they need an advocate. Tell this guy he needs an advocate. So word goes back through these subterranean carer channels. You need an advocate. So Mark asked the council for an advocate. And initially the council didn't know that they had to do that, but eventually they got an advocate. And this advocate is like the superhero of this story. They write a report saying, why is no one looking at how to get Stephen home? And, if the council is not prepared to send Stephen home, this should go to court. We need a court to decide this. Now, most councils are not baddies, and I'm sure Hillingdon lots of the time aren't baddies, but in this story they're kind of baddies, because what they were doing is they were telling Mark, oh yeah, we're going to send your son home. Don't worry, we're going to send your son home. So Mark's like sitting, waiting for his son to come home, but actually they were lying to him. And what they were secretly planning to do is send Stephen to a hospital, an assessment and treatment unit. So the advocate has said this should go to court. Mark is not going to court because he's just been told that his son's coming home anyway, and also because the council have threatened him. If you keep challenging this, then maybe we're not going to give you the support you need for Stephen to come home, right? So there's all kinds of devious, nasty things going on. But then one day, Mark learns what their real plan is. They're going to send Stephen to a hospital, and I hear about this again because by this time I've joined Mark's Facebook group. And I'm like, we've got to get this into court. We've got to get this into court today to stop this happening, because once he's in one of those places, it gets very, very hard to get people out, as you guys probably know. But back then, it was very, very hard to find the right kind of solicitor to challenge it. So I started ringing up lots of people. We were working our way down this big, long list. Another guy was working his way down a list, and everyone was busy and not returning our calls. And in the end, I rang another mate of mine, a solicitor called Ben Conroy, who's in Cornwall, who does lots of this kind of law. And I was like, Ben, this is the situation. We need to get this guy out. We need to get it to court today. Can you help? And Ben says, funny you mentioned this, Lucy, I'm at a dinner with lots of lawyers. So Ben stands up and is like, can anyone help? And we find a lawyer. The lawyer goes to court. They say to the court, we want Stephen home, and they get a judge called Mostyn, Mr. Justice Mostyn, and Mr. Justice Mostyn says, this guy's got to be home by Christmas. This was December the 21st, right? So Stephen's been in there nearly a year. It gets to court, and within 5 days, Stephen's home. Now, what happened next is it went back to court after Stephen got home. And by the way, he is still home. He's living in his own flat. He's got a team of personal assistants, back to living his best life. His dad describes him as king of his castle. But the court did something called a review. It looked at what the council had done, and it said, this council breached this guy's human rights. That he violated his right to liberty, and they violated his right to respect for home and private life. And a newspaper called The Independent had a front page story about it. And this front page made me burst into tears in the supermarket when I saw it, because it had a picture of Mark and Stephen sitting together, and the headline just said, the right to love. So that's what the case ended up being about. Like, do you have the right to live with the people you love? And I suppose what I'd say is the stories tells us that the safeguards can be really important. I don't know if Stephen would have got home if it hadn't been for the safeguards. Mark wrote a book about it afterwards, and he said the safeguards saved Stephen's life. But what the story also tells us is they can go wrong, and it can take a really long time. And so my feeling is we need to make the safeguards better and work better, not that we need to get rid of them. So does that answer your question? Do you understand? So it's about an independent assessment, an advocate, and the court.
That was really interesting. The next question is, why do you think the government want to change the law on dolls?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is about what we held the workshop on, isn't it? Now, the thing to remember about the government is it's not one person, it's lots of different people. And it's lots of different departments. So what we've got going on at the moment is a bit of a mess, right? So we've got the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Justice at the moment are led by an MP called Dominic Raab. Now, Dominic Raab, for reasons we won't go into, hates the Human Rights Act, right? He does not like, he says that he doesn't dislike human rights, but he thinks that judges have got it wrong, okay? And so they wrote this called consultation document saying how they want to change the Human Rights Act. And one of the things that he wrote, or his team wrote in this consultation document, is that the courts had got it wrong about what deprivation of liberty meant. He felt that that it was applying to too many people, and it is applying to a lot of people, right? There was this court ruling which said that deprivation of liberty means the same thing for a disabled person as a non-disabled person. Because before that, what could happen is if you had a learning disability or dementia or autism, you could be living a life where you were very restricted, even restrained, even sedated. And if the courts thought that was normal for somebody with your condition, that you weren't deprived of your liberty, even though for that judge sitting there, that definitely would be a deprivation of liberty if it was happening for them. And what that meant was that people could be living in these situations and not have those safeguards. So to give you one example, there was a guy who had a brain injury and he was in a care home where he was really unhappy. He told the judge that the care home did his head in. And it did his head in so much that he actually broke the front door down trying to run away, right? And before this really important Supreme Court case, the judge, who's actually a really sound judge, who heard that case, said he's not deprived of his liberty because it's normal to be restricted if you've got a brain injury, and he's got nowhere else to go anyway. And what that meant was he didn't get those safeguards to challenge what was happening to him. He just had to lump it. So Ministry of Justice want to say that deprivation of liberty means something different to what the courts have said at the moment. They're not very clear about what they do think it means, but it's likely to mean far fewer people with disabilities or dementia get safeguards. Then, and here's the really strange thing, over in the Department of Health and Social Care, completely different department, completely different ministry, they are getting ready to bring in a whole new law called the Liberty Protection Safeguards that's going to give even more people safeguards. And some of us think that those two departments aren't really talking to each other about this. They seem to be traveling along two completely different lines. It's all a bit of a muddle. But basically, I think it's fair to say that both departments would like to narrow down what we mean when we talk about deprivation of liberty. And the effect of that would be that fewer people had those rights to best interest assessment by somebody independent, advocacy, and going to court.
Right. Do you know what the new law will be yet?
No. I mean, we don't know what will happen to the Human Rights Act. That's really up in the air. I mean, it's my hope that what is happening in Ukraine at the moment with Vladimir Putin violating his own people's rights and the rights of people in the Ukraine might make people in this country think more carefully about hanging on to our human rights. That's my hope. It might not happen. Meanwhile, these other guys in the Department of Health are busy trying to set up this new law called the Liberty Protection Safeguards that will apply to more people. And that will include people in supported living who at the moment don't have very good safeguards. So that's about 50,000 people, probably mostly with learning disabilities. They're working on the rules about that at the moment, and it's probably going to come in next year or 2024.
Do you think that the changes in the law have anything to do with social care and the crisis in the country?
Yes and no. I think part of the reason some of us think the safeguards are important, and I think this has probably affected why the Supreme Court felt that the safeguards were so important, they wanted quite a big definition of deprivation of liberty, is that we all know that things are going quite wrong in social care at the moment. We know that people are not getting care and support at all when they need to be. We know that the people who are getting care and support are having it cut right back. And that does impact on people's right to liberty. It means, for example, that a person might be moved into a care home instead of being supported at home because it's cheaper. We know that people, whether they're living at home or in a care home, might not get the support they need to go out and about and do the things they love. And a lot of that comes down to money. Some of it comes down to just kind of inherited attitudes and cultures in social care in some places towards disabled people. So I think the reason the safeguards are important right now is partly to do with saying, can we be less restrictive, please, in the way we're caring for people? But one of the big problems is just because you've got safeguards doesn't give you more money for your care. So you might have, when the best interest assessor comes in, and even when the court comes in, they have to choose between the options that the council or the NHS are offering. If those options are rubbish, they just have to choose between rubbish options. And so it is kind of connected with the crisis in care, but it's not going to fix it. We need to fix that crisis in care.
What are your hopes and fears for the new law?
If this law is going to work, these new liberty protection safeguards, it's because of two things, right? It's because, firstly, people who are deprived of their liberty are helped to understand their rights. And that's where organisations like People First are so important. I think I'm hoping in the future to be able to work with self-advocacy groups like you guys to help raise awareness of people's rights, to help produce tools to help people shout and stamp to claim their rights. But the other thing that's really important is that people who work in social care, the people like who are doing these frontline assessments and the people who will replace the best interest assessors, really use that law to deliver the best they can. Okay, so I told you the story of how things went horribly wrong for Stephen Neary, and that's because councils have a huge amount of power, and it's quite hard to challenge that. It took Mark and Stephen a long time, and they had a lot of support in doing that. So the main thing really is making sure that the social care and social workforce are really on board with this, are really on board with human rights, and are really passionate about giving people the best support they can to exercise their rights. If it's going to work at all, it's going to work because of them. And I think it would be great to see more joint working between that workforce and between self-advocacy groups like yourselves to raise awareness of how important these rights are.
People First were pleased to be invited to an accessibility workshop on Zoom a few weeks ago. Have you any good feedback and learned something new at the event?
Thank you. I mean, I learned a huge amount at the event. I really did. I learned lots about how people see human rights. So some of you guys wrote a really amazing poem about what it felt like actually when the government starts saying things like, we don't think human rights are so great. I learned that it feels pretty scary actually. And I learned that you all feel that liberty safeguards are really important. And that was really useful for me to know. Do you know what the main thing I learned was? That even though this law is quite complicated, that and some people find it quite boring, that you guys are really interested. And so what I've learned from that is I want to do more to continue working with People First and other People Firsts around the country to help share that learning. And the other thing I've learned is that it's not just a case of me turning up and giving a talk or something. It's about working with you to present that information really accessibly. So I'm not very good at that, but you guys are. You're the experts on that. So coming to you first and saying, how can we do this? How can we run this workshop? How can we create these videos? That's what I learned.
We have seen the government are postponing the changes to dolls. Do you know why this is?
Yeah. So the government is trying to bring in this new law called the Liberty Protection Safeguards that will replace the law that's working at the moment called the Deprivation of Liberty Safeguards. And it is quite important that they do that, because at the moment, people in places like supported living don't have very good safeguards, don't have very good rights. And the new law will give them that. What nobody predicted was COVID. And so, as I'm sure you guys know, I mean, it's thrown a big spanner in the works of everybody, really, hasn't it? And the Department of Health have been really, really busy trying to deal with COVID. And the other thing is that in order for this new law to work, we need care homes, supported living, hospitals, doctors, social workers, local authorities, everyone to really understand it. And at the moment, those professionals are they're exhausted. You know, we're all exhausted, right? We're all really exhausted, and they're particularly exhausted, I'd say. And they need to be in a place where they can really engage with the consultation, where they can really get to grips with the changes that need to happen. And I think the government's been holding off until things have stabilised a bit. I mean, I know the government is saying things have stabilised now, but both my kids have got COVID, so it really doesn't feel like that over here. I'm really hopeful the safeguards will come in next year or early 2024. But a lot depends on what happens with COVID, and life can be unpredictable, right?
Can you tell us about the book you are writing?
Yeah, okay. So I've just finished one book, which is about the history of these deprivation of liberty safeguards. And what I want to say about that is I'm working with a really, really cool artist who herself draws on care and support to create a movie about it. It's going to be quite short, and I'll send it to you guys when it's finished, because I think it probably explains the book better than I can right now. But the book really is about saying, 20 years ago, lots of people were living in care homes, and they were living, they were not allowed out, not allowed to go home, not allowed to live somewhere else. Lots of people were being told things like you can't spend your own money on a mobile phone, or you can't go out unless you've got permission, and you can't go out today because there's no one to take you, so you'll have to wait until a week on Tuesday before you can go to the shops or something. And nobody ever said this is a deprivation of liberty. And we are saying that now. And so the book is saying, well, why have we started to ask this question? And it's to do with making sure people get those safeguards. And some people also want to say the safeguards aren't enough. We just need to get everybody to have liberty. So there are some people who go even beyond saying we need safeguards, and they're saying, look, nobody should be restricted at all. So the book's about those people as well. And I'm writing another book now about the history of the Mental Capacity Act. And I've discovered some really cool stuff about People First and how they campaigned about the Mental Capacity Act back in the 90s and 2000s.
What inspired you to become a doctor?
Well, I'm a doctor of law, but I'm not a lawyer, so I'm a bit odd like that. What inspired me is this service that I was working in, the one that told this guy that he couldn't spend his own money on a mobile phone. It also told the people who lived there that they weren't allowed to watch telly except on a Friday night, when they were allowed to watch a Disney film as if they were children, no other telly. There was a woman there who'd been told her whole life she wasn't allowed to have kids. And all she wanted to do, because she had not been allowed to have her own kids, was work with children. And she was told she had to do things like pottery and gardening, which to some people sound very nice, but that wasn't what she wanted. There was a guy there who was very upset because he wasn't being allowed to do the things he wanted to do, and he got very distressed at dinner. So they made him leave his home and live somewhere else. People were having really rubbish experiences. And I ended up having to leave this community, actually, because the people who ran it were very, very anti-person-centred planning at the time. So a whole bunch of staff that wanted to bring in person-centred planning were kind of forced to leave. And when I left, I had a chat with this woman that wasn't allowed to have her own kids. And she said to me, can you do something about this, about what's happening to us? And I can't on my own, right? But at that time, I hoped that the law could. And so that's why I ended up looking at this law, because I hoped that that law, it's not going to fix everything, but it might mean it happens a bit less. You know, it might make things better for some people. And it's about trying to do that.
What is your PhD in?
It's in law, and it's on this law called the Mental Capacity Act. And the thesis, the book that I wrote about it, is looking at how the Mental Capacity Act works if you're someone with a learning disability in a care home or supported living.
Lucy, do come back, all right?
I'd love to. I hope I haven't been too boring for you all.
Right, you've not bored me at all.
Okay, I'd love to come back. Let's do another workshop together in the future as well.
Thank you very much.
Take care, everyone.
The changes to the law and the proposed liberty protection safeguards will affect many people in the UK. And it will affect many adults with learning disabilities. Some of the members at People First KC wrote a poem to express how we feel about the proposed changes to the law.
What we want, a poem by People First, Keithlyn Craven.
I want to be myself and I want to be happy.
I don't want to be disrespected.
It's important that our human rights give everyone equal respect.
If I didn't have my human rights, I'd feel frustrated, disappointed and sad.
I deserve my rights.
I deserve my voice.
And I want the law to keep me
And my friends
and everyone safe. Thanks to Dr. Lucy for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the podcast, and don't forget to please like and share it.